nation decides.
As the parties gear up their campaigns for the next general election.
Who will be left standing when the British people make one of the biggest decisions of their lives?
Who will rise?
And who will fall?
Let's find out together.
For every moment, the highs, the lows, the twists and turns.
We'll be with you for every step of this journey.
In 2024, GB News is Britain's election channel.
I'm Michelle Dewberry, and I'm not here to tell you what to think. I'd much rather hear what you have to say. So, send in your opinions to gbviews@gbnews.com. Keep them clean, and you never know, I might read them out. With my panel here on Jubes & Co, we debate, we get stuck into the issues of the day on a show where all views are welcome, especially yours. GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
I'm Christopher Hope.
And I'm Gloria Di Piero, bringing you
PMQ's live here on GB News. Every Wednesday we'll bring you live coverage of Prime Minister's questions when Rishi Sunak and Sir Keir Starmer go head-to-head in the House of Commons.
We'll be asking our viewers and listeners to submit the questions that they would like to put to the Prime Minister, and we'll put that to our panel of top politicians in our Westminster studio.
That's PMQ's live here on GB News, Britain's election channel.
In the GB Newsroom, we bring you the news as it happens. With our team of dedicated journalists across the UK, we're ready to give you accurate reporting every day. When the news breaks, we'll be there with bulletins on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Your weekend starts here with Friday Night Live with me, Mark Dolan, 8 till 9 on GB News. Big stories, big guests and big laughs as we get you ready for a cracking weekend. That's Friday Night Live with Mark Dolan, Fridays 8 till 9 on GB News. Bring your own drinks, the admission's free.
Good afternoon, Britain.
Good afternoon, Britain. Join us, Tom and Emily,
To find out what's happening in the heart of Westminster.
and why it matters to you.
Weekdays from midday, we bring you the most compelling stories from across the United Kingdom.
And from your doorstep to our inbox,
That's right, we want to hear from you.
GB News.
Britain's news channel.
There you are. Good evening. Lovely to have you. Welcome along to Neil Oliver Live on GB News TV and on the radio. Tonight I'll be joined by American professor and podcaster, writer, citizen journalist, evolutionary biologist though, Brett Weinstein, to talk about many things, but mostly asking him about his recent trip to the Darien Gap in Panama to find out what he saw there. Also on GB News, I'll be joined by Canadian journalist David Krayden to discuss claims that fabricated intelligence was used to justify the crackdown on those who participated in the Freedom Convoy, the Canadian truckers as they're better known. And I'll be joined by a Dutch farmer to bring us up to date on exactly what is happening there in relation to the farmers' protest. All of that and lots of chat with my panellist for this evening, my friend, journalist, fellow presenter Jasmine Birtles. But first, it's the latest news headlines from Ray Addison.
Thanks, Neil. Our latest stories now. Stormont's first nationalist First Minister has pledged to work with unionists to build a better future for Northern Ireland. The historic appointment of Sinn Féin's Michelle O'Neill was confirmed as power sharing was restored 2 years after it collapsed. It follows an agreement between the DUP and the government over post-Brexit trade. DUP's Emma Little-Pengley has become the new Deputy FM, a role that carries equal legal power. Michelle O'Neill is promising to be inclusive and respectful.
We mark a moment of equality and a moment of progress, a new opportunity to work and to grow together. Confident in that wherever we come from, whatever our aspirations are, we can and we must build our future together. I'm really delighted to see every MLA back in this chamber today, and I welcome the fact that the DUP have decided to re-enter the democratic institutions and that the outcome of last year's Assembly election is now being respected.
Police hunting for a suspected chemical attacker have released new video of a home in Newcastle being searched. 2 containers with potential corrosives were recovered. Warnings can be seen on the labels, and tests are now ongoing to see if they held the substance that was used during an attack in South London. Abdul Azadi hasn't been seen since an image was taken of him at King's Cross Station on Wednesday night. 31-year-old mother remains in hospital with injuries believed to be life-changing. Her 2 young daughters were also hurt, but not as badly as Thirst thought. Iraq has accused the United States of putting the Middle East on the brink of an abyss following a series of airstrikes overnight. The US struck 85 targets in Syria and Iraq in response to a drone attack on a US military base that killed 3 soldiers last weekend. Nearly 40 people, including civilians, have been killed. The UK says it supports Washington's right to respond to attacks from militant groups linked to Iran. Iraq's warned that the strikes will have disastrous consequences for the region. Well, Scotland Yard say that more than 10,000 pro-Palestine supporters have marched through central London today. Members of the Stop the War Coalition and Palestine Solidarity Campaign called for an end to the Israel-Hamas conflict. One woman was arrested on suspicion of setting off a smoke bomb or flare. These protesters explained their demands.
People need to support Palestine and stop what's going on, because day to day, every day, more and more horrific sights are seen.
The people are talking and governments need to listen, not only the UK. All governments need to listen because the people have spoken.
We are all humans. We all should feel each other. We shouldn't be, Gaza shouldn't be like that. People shouldn't be killed and slaughtered like that. So I'm praying for a better world, a peaceful world.
French police have ruled out terrorism as a motive for a knife attack at a train station in Paris earlier. The suspect has been arrested following the incident at Gare de Lyon this morning. 3 people were hurt but didn't suffer life-threatening injuries. French media are saying that the attacker was from Mali and carried an Italian driving licence. Train services have again been affected by strike action across parts of the country. Drivers, who are members of ASLEF Union at Avanti West Coast, East Midlands Railway and West Midlands Railway, are staging a 24-hour walkout over their pay and conditions. The action started earlier this week and will continue on Monday too, while a ban on overtime will last until Tuesday. ASLEF saying that drivers have not had a pay rise for almost 5 years, but the government is urging the union to accept an offer that was made last year. For the latest stories, you can sign up to GB News alerts by scanning the QR code that's on your screens right now, or go to gbnews.com/alerts. Now, let's get back to Neil.
French writer Voltaire said, "Those who can make you believe absurdities can make you commit atrocities." Absurdity is the new normal, bringing atrocity that bit closer. We live in a world of the absurd, have done for years now. There must be a department of the absurd somewhere, with staff incentivised by bonuses and coming up with the most absurd notions for sale to the public. Last week it was about a citizen army to fight the Russians. Your country needs you. Welcome back to 1915 and preparations for the catastrophe of the Somme. That absurdity came hot on the heels of our Prime Minister, Rishi Sunak, unelected and unwanted but empowered to make decisions on our behalf, an absurdity in itself, pledging British support for Ukraine for 100 years or more, meaning your taxes, your children's, your grandchildren's. And has anyone asked the Ukrainian people if they're even up for 100 years' war? It's been going on for so long now, the absurdity, it's getting hard to remember that the world wasn't always this way. COVID changed everything. The green light for the rollout of all the absurdity in the world. Stockpiled absurdity was pushed like knockoff watches and handbags out the backs of lorries. Healthy people shut in their homes. People arrested for walking alone in the mountains or running along beaches. Heaven forbid they might stay fit and boost their vitamin D. Elderly people on end-of-life care, midazolam and morphine, instead of getting treatment for illness. Gyms closed but fast food outlets open round the clock, the better to replace muscle with fat. Illness instead of health, chains on swings in play parks, hazard tape on park benches, magic arrows on the floors of supermarkets, fear stoked that COVID couldn't get you if you were sat down in a restaurant, but that it might kill you if you walked to the toilet without a strip of blue paper over your mouth and nose. Scientists have sown more fear porn by claiming COVID is the new HIV. And who was up to his elbows in experiments concerning both? Oh yes, Anthony Fauci, former boss of the US Centre for Disease Control. Nothing to see here. Now the leader of Slovakia, Robert Fico, has vowed to investigate what happened to his people in that time of the biggest financial deal in European Commission history, being the order for vast quantities of the so-called vaccines, and to ask why so many people were urged to take products of unproven efficacy. Here at home, our own COVID inquiry won't even consider the matter of the so-called vaccines until after the next election, if ever. And then the absurdity of said PM Sunak standing up in Parliament last week to declare unequivocally that COVID vaccines are safe. More and more, the absurdity is obvious, like the grin on the Cheshire cat that won't go away. In Canada, a federal judge ruled last week that Prime Minister Justin Trudeau's use of the Emergencies Act to crush the Freedom Convoy protests by the country's truckers was unreasonable and violated charter rights. Undaunted and unashamed, Trudeau's government is appealing the decision. Canadian author Regina Watteau has published a new book, Fissman's Fraud, detailing the crime committed against the Canadian people when what she calls hate science, exploiting imaginary data and excluding real-world data, was used to invert reality and to demonise and destroy those who chose not to receive the experimental gene therapies. She details how mainstream media and academic institutions conspired to make impossible the lives of those disinclined to risk the shots, and so emboldened the Canadian government to freeze the bank accounts of those taking part in or supporting the truckers' protests, even to throw them in jail. The truth is out there, and yet those responsible remain in place, moving on to the next absurdity. It won't be long before the guilty exonerate themselves of all blame by declaring none of it actually happened. I kid you not. Canada is the country in which a real-life Nazi was, just last year, treated to a standing ovation in that country's parliament, applauded by Justin Trudeau and the rest of the parliamentarians for his efforts to fight the Russians, our allies, without whom Nazism would have conquered the world. Beyond absurd, utterly shameful, and yet consequences for Trudeau were there none. Around the jabbed countries of the world, excess deaths are, to put it mildly, alarming. Alarming to anyone with their eyes open, that is. Others injured by the injectables are ignored, ridiculed, living lives in limbo after having been persuaded they were doing the right thing or downright coerced on pain of losing jobs. Government statistics here in Britain, in the United States, across Europe, in Asia, show people of all ages dying unexpectedly in large numbers. Heart attacks are up by 20% in the middle-aged. Fatal heart attacks in people not previously known to have been suffering ill health. Excess deaths for the young are higher too. Mortuaries are overflowing, making room for extra corpses, funeral directors struggling to cope. And yet, despite the efforts of lone voices like that of Andrew Bridgen MP, doggedly asking questions about causes and seeking compassionate debate by his parliamentary colleagues, all but a handful steadfastly refuses to talk about why thousands of their constituents are dropping dead, and not of COVID. Is that behaviour by so many elected representatives just absurd? Or are we witnessing a silent, unquestioned atrocity? Those who can make you believe absurdities can make you commit atrocities, remember. I say absurdity came close to atrocity in the COVID era. Peaceful protesters in Western countries all over the world were beaten by police armed with riot gear and pepper spray. Young women pinned against walls, throttled by policemen. Here in Britain, mainstream media figures made space for speculating about whether those refusing the injectables ought to be held down in the street and forcibly jabbed, or driven from society as though their very existence was a threat. Absurdity is all around. No functioning border on Britain's southern coastline, no functioning southern border in the United States. Veteran soldiers and other homeless cold on our streets while migrants are paid to stay in hotels and handed free mobile phones. Someone said this week, if they can make you believe men can have babies, they've got you. In this world of the absurd, we're told men can be women and women can be men. We're not just told this, we're threatened that if we don't endorse the absurdity, we're hateful people liable for prosecution. Laws are being rewritten to erase the existence of women as an immutable biological fact, so that being a woman is nothing more than a choice available to any and all. Is this just absurd or is it atrocious? I say what is atrocious is the hoax that is the so-called climate crisis. Billions of pounds and dollars being made by those in control of the propaganda, while billions of people are ushered ever closer to the abyss. There are nearly 8 billion of us alive now, and an estimated 4 billion depend on food grown with nitrogen fertilisers. Without those fertilisers, without that food, those billions will likely die of man-made starvation, and yet claims have been made that gas resultant from those fertilisers is bringing planet Earth to boiling point. Nothing less than war, attritional war, is being waged on the farmers of the world by authoritarian governments. But in response to that grotesque absurdity, those farmers and more of the people of the world are standing up and fighting back for the sake of all. Standing by while millions are denied food would be an atrocity, and yet by accepting the nonsense of net zero, the global suicide note written on our behalf by transnational entities like the World Health Organization, the World Economic Forum and the United Nations, the claptrap trotted out annually at COP and Davos by corporations like BlackRock, we're doing little more than cheering the arrival of the horsemen of the apocalypse. CO2, plant food for a greener world, is demonised as poison. This too is absurd. Those in pursuit of control of information, control of the mainstream already achieved, and control of the internet next up, have coined a new term for information they simply don't like. This is so-called malinformation, information which is openly and frankly acknowledged as truth, as fact, but truthful facts that get in the way of the powerful having their way. To paraphrase multimillionaire climate hoaxer and sometime US presidential candidate Al Gore, malinformation is inconvenient truth. During the run-up to the 2020 US election, the contents of Hunter Biden's laptop were deemed malinformation by those backing his dad. And though that laptop was real and those damning contents were real, their existence was whitewashed until Biden Sr. was in the White House. Talk about influencing an election. Allegations that Donald Trump colluded with Russia in return for power have been exposed as downright lies, and yet such claims are levelled at the most popular politician in the United States to this day. Former Speaker of the House Nancy Pelosi says those protesting the war in Gaza are doing Putin's bidding. We're told that unless we are ready to go to war with Russia, Putin will push ever westwards. War is the ultimate atrocity, leading to slaughter, and yet war is the goal of the governments of the West. War in Ukraine, in the Middle East, the dream of war with Russia, with Iran, with China, driven as they are by the appetites and wants of those transnational corporations that make all their decisions for them. All the way back in 1915, during the war that was supposed to end all wars, what an absurd notion that was, another philosopher, Georg Gurdjieff, said, "In times of madness, such as wars, men suddenly seem to lose even the small amount of common sense they had and turn into complete automatons, giving themselves over to wholesale destruction in vast numbers, even losing the instinct of self-preservation. There are periods in the life of humanity which generally coincide with the fall of cultures and civilization, when the masses irretrievably lose their reason and begin to destroy everything that has been created by the centuries and millenniums of culture." Here's the thing. Today, it is not the many who would knowingly destroy everything, but the few, prepared as they are to wreck our world rather than surrender an iota of their power and wealth. They would commit all manner of atrocities in our name. But the masses are increasingly aware of the absurdity and of the imminence of atrocity. The great awakening from the nightmare is all around us. I predict the next global pandemic will be made not of some confected disease, but of an overwhelming, enlightening wave of sanity and truth. Joining me tonight, as I said at the top, is financial and business journalist, author and presenter Jasmine Birtles. Jasmine, I feel we live in a world of madness and absurdity.
Yes.
How do you feel?
Well, clearly, absolutely. I mean, I agree with every single item that you've mentioned there. You know, I could add a few.
Please do.
Yes. One of the things that's getting me at the moment is the use of language, of course, and this is something that you've covered before. But I was thinking about the absurdity of these repeated phrases that we got through the COVID nonsense. You know, it's a pandemic of the unvaccinated. And for example, with Ukraine, we had so many people going, just one more push, just a few more billion, just one more push. That was about a year and a half ago, just one more push. Well, it's gone downhill from there. They kept telling us it's going to be all right. Now, we've got all sorts of politicians saying that anybody, the farmers, for example, the farmers in Europe are right-wing extremists. Anybody who's taking on the establishment, anybody who's saying, decent, normal, ordinary people going, this isn't right. Oh, you're a far-right extremist.
We'll definitely put that to the Dutch farmer and farming spokesman who's coming on later. But yes, that's a beautiful illustration of an absurdity.
Yeah, really.
The idea that those farmers who grow the food upon which we depend 3 times or more every day, people who've got better things to do but are motivated to get in their tractors and drive into cities to protest their predicament, are characterised by the mainstream media and those governments as far-right extremists.
Yes, and anybody is. Somebody in Germany, there's a German MP who's been described as a far-right extremist because he's questioning immigration. He's just questioning it. So the whole idea, and this is so Orwellian, that anybody who's questioning the established view, the established government, whatever, you know, however absurd what they're doing is immediately a far-right extremist. And I'm sure, you know, they're calling Andrew Bridgen a far-right extremist for questioning possibly that there might possibly be something not 100% right with the COVID alleged vaccine.
And it's hard to pinpoint what might be the worst thing that's going on at the moment.
Yes.
Because it's like shooting fish in the proverbial barrel.
Exactly, yeah.
But the excess deaths...
Yes.
That they are not being discussed.
No, exactly. And doesn't it say a lot that they're particularly not being discussed before the election? I mean, that kind of says all you need to know, really. From what I'm hearing, excess deaths in this country currently are about 13%. I'm not sure it sort of goes, you know, around. It's certainly in double figures anyway. And you would think, as you said, you would think that somebody would be going,
just a question.
Just a question. No.
We're on a first break already, Jasmine. I'll be joined afterwards by Brett Weinstein to discuss what he has witnessed on the southern border of the United States. This is Neil Oliver live on GB News.
I'm Christopher Hope.
And I'm Gloria Di Piero, bringing you
PMQ's live here on GB News. Every Wednesday, we'll bring you live coverage of Prime Minister's questions when Rishi Sunak and Sir Keir Starmer go head-to-head in the House of Commons.
We'll be asking our viewers and listeners to submit the questions that they would like to put to the Prime Minister, and we'll put that to our panel of top politicians in our Westminster studio.
That's PMQ's live here on GB News, Britain's election channel.
Good afternoon, Britain.
Good afternoon, Britain. Join us, Tom and Emily,
To find out what's happening in the heart of Westminster.
and why it matters to you.
Weekdays from midday, we bring you the most compelling stories from across the United Kingdom.
And from your doorstep to our inbox.
That's right, we want to hear from you.
GB News,
Britain's news channel.
GB News, unlike other broadcasters, isn't obsessed with the London-Westminster bubble. We think there's a nation beyond the M25, and that's why we talk about the issues that matter across the land. Join me on State of the Nation, 8 to 9 o'clock, Monday to Thursday, on GB News. Daisy's listening, and you should too.
In the GB Newsroom, we bring you the news as it happens. With our team of dedicated journalists across the UK, we're ready to give you accurate reporting every day. When the news breaks, we'll be there with bulletins on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Big news, big debates, big opinion. Patrick Christie's Tonight is the week's biggest show. Every weekday, 9 to 11 p.m, we've got the inside track on the day's top stories. There'll be sharp takes you won't get anywhere else. We will set the news agenda, not just follow it, and I want to bring you along for the ride. Whatever it is, we'll have our finger on the pulse. It's news, but it's this close to entertainment. Patrick Christie's Tonight, 9 to 11 p.m, only on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Your weekend starts here with Friday Night Live with me, Mark Dolan, 8 till 9 on GB News. Big stories, big guests and big laughs as we get you ready for a cracking weekend. That's Friday Night Live with Mark Dolan, Fridays 8 till 9 on GB News. Bring your own drinks, the admission's free.
I'm Andrew Doyle. Join me at 7 o'clock every Sunday night for Free Speech Nation, the show where I tackle the week's biggest stories in politics and current affairs with the help of my 2 comedian panellists and a variety of special guests.
Free Speech Nation, Sunday nights from 7 on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Wake up to the headlines with Headliners every morning at 5 a.m. We treat you to the day's biggest stories before anyone else, 7 days a week. You can catch up on everything you need to know before you've even had your kippers. Headliners every morning at 5 a.m. only on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Welcome back. Evolutionary biologist Brett Weinstein joins me now to describe, amongst other things, what he saw during a visit to Panama and the Darien Gap. Brett, thank you for joining me.
Very good to be with you, Neil.
Great to see you. What is happening? Why were you there in Panama of all places, and what did you see?
I was invited to Panama by Michael Yan, who is a former Green Beret who has been traveling the globe trying to understand the hidden story behind many of these global patterns. And he has been looking in the Darien of Panama at the mass migration that is flowing up from South America for years. He's been sending me materials which are quite shocking, but there was a part of me that needed to see the story for myself in order even just to establish that the facts were what they appeared.
What is the scale? You know, when you talk, I mean, this is jungle. You know, it's probably important to describe the actual geographical context of this place. What is the scale of the movement of people through that treacherous place?
So the Darien Gap is a gap in the Pan American Highway, a road that runs from Prudhoe Bay, Alaska to the southern tip of South America with a 60-mile empty stretch in one of the most impenetrable jungles in the world. There are certainly thousands, occasionally tens of thousands of people moving up from South America through the Darien Gap daily. This migration has been ratcheting up in scale over time, and on the ground it is quite obvious that there are preparations being made to expand the migration. This is all being done without any discussion with the citizens of the United States, which is the place where almost all of the migrants are headed, and without the agreement of the citizens of the countries through which these migrants will pass.
What nationalities are coming? You know, it's in Middle America or Central America that they're passing through, but who is it that's on the move?
It is an extremely diverse group of people. There are many people fleeing from South America, especially Venezuela, but we also met people from Afghanistan, Iran, Yemen, the Caribbean, for example, Haiti. It's a very diverse migration. But I have to say that one of the things that I concluded upon seeing this in person, I should say my son and I traveled there together and we're in discussion the whole time. Chris Martinson was also there. But one of the things that we saw was that there appears to be a migration which is economic in nature, people fleeing toward the U.S. for economic reasons. And there also is separately housed a very large Chinese population that is seemingly of a different nature. The migrants are all forthcoming about the nature of their migration, about the tribulations that they experienced in the Darien Gap, with the exception of the Chinese, who will not discuss what they are doing and why. And I became ever more alarmed at seeing the distinction not only in these two populations, but also in the treatment of the two populations by the Panamanians. The Panamanians allowed us to range freely across the migrant camps that involved people flowing in from all over the world. At the Chinese camp, we were not allowed in, and we were not allowed to take any pictures. So we did take some, but they were done covertly. And the distinction is something that really is hard to appreciate until you've seen it in person.
It's a big question, and I don't suppose there are any unequivocal answers you can give, but what's your assessment of what is happening there? In particular, why are many, many thousands of young Chinese men travelling to Middle America to head north?
Well, because they are not forthcoming, we have to speculate. I would say one thing that is true is that there is a kind of hostility that comes from the Chinese migrants when one attempts to engage them in conversation. I find that very surprising. If this was a migration of people either fleeing an oppressive regime or seeking a better life in America, you would expect them to be curious about Americans and to want to interact with these people from a culture that they aspire to join. I got none of that from these migrants. They were cagey, not forthcoming, and seemed interested in deliberately misleading us. At one point, one person tried to trick Michael Yan, who has lived in China, into believing that he was from Korea. And when Michael tripped him up and got him to speak Chinese reflexively, there was laughter among his compatriots. So this felt, it's frightening to see a disproportionately young male population of what appear to be Chinese nationals moving towards the U.S. without our awareness.
Now, in a past life almost, well, you are an evolutionary biologist, which gives you that perspective on everything that you look at. You know, we all know about, you know, China having experienced its one-child policy. There's an imbalance in the male-female demographic in that country. As a biologist, when you look at us as a species, do you get an insight about what might be happening?
Yes, and it's a disturbing one. There's a principle in biology and evolution that sex ratios tend to default to 1 to 1. And the reason for that is because although males and females are different in the way they reproduce, on average, they produce the same number of offspring. So when a population has a surplus of males, it makes sense to produce a female. And when it has a surplus of females, it makes sense to produce a male. The question is, why does that logic not apply in China? If you were a Chinese couple and you were going to have a child, if there was a surplus of males, it would make sense to have a female, because not only would she be certain to find a mate, but she would have her choice because she would be in high demand. So the fact that that logic did not obtain in China is curious, and it made me wonder if there is an evolutionary adaptation at a higher level in which populations sometimes produce a surplus of males in preparation for war. So it is only a hypothesis, but in seeing a migration of military-age males flowing from China through the Darien Gap into Central America and up to the United States, I have to wonder if this might not be a military force waiting for orders that is being deployed covertly in the midst of a migration that makes it hard for us to recognize it.
Jasmine Birtles, Brett, Jasmine's with me in the studio. How do you feel listening to that story, that reflection on sights seen?
Well, it does mirror what I've been hearing, actually, particularly in the US. I've certainly heard of Chinese nationals coming over, as Brett says, young men, just men, and they've been offered to have their passports fast-tracked, their nationalisation fast-tracked, if they will join the army. So that's something that I've definitely heard. And also, as Brett's speaking, it makes me think of what's happening in Europe, not just in the United States. I mean, we're constantly talking about the young fighting-age men who are coming in boats illegally into this country. It's happening in other countries in Europe. It's odd. It's not, it does worry us. And of course, we're all called right-wing extremists, even for questioning this. But we are questioning it because there's something not right about it. It's unbalanced.
Brett, I've been listening to you talk on various matters for years now, and I remember all the way back in 3-4 years ago, perhaps, you talked about a trajectory that made you wary of civil war in the United States of America, all the way from defund or abolish the police all the way through. Are you still joining dots that lead to that kind of internecine conflict?
Yes, and I wonder if that potential, which is in evidence this month more than it has been at any point in memory, if that's not part of a larger story. One of the things that's not obvious looking at the migration in Panama to the untrained observer or to somebody who's not on the ground is the degree to which the international community, the UN, the International Organization for Migration, the HIAS, all of these organizations are facilitating and inspiring the migrants to transit the Darien Gap, which is a tragedy in and of itself. People are dying in the jungle. But the international community appears to be possessed of the idea that migration is in and of itself a good thing, and that it is their job to encourage it and facilitate it, which is a large explanation, I believe, for what is taking place in Panama, what is taking place on the U.S. southern border, and what is taking place in Europe.
And it can surely only lead to trouble because, as you pointed out at the top of our encounter this evening, the American people, the incumbent citizens, are not being consulted about this, far less their approval sought.
Yes, in fact, I think that it is the West itself that is jeopardized. And believe me, I'm not inherently an opponent of migrants. My ancestors certainly migrated, and it can be a very good thing for a society, but it has to be done at a scale that can be absorbed, and it also has to be limited to people who actually aspire to join the societies to which they are migrating. And nobody is asking these folks whether they really want to be Americans or Europeans, and I think it is a tragic error.
Challenging reflections there, Brett Weinstein, evolutionary biologist. I hope that we will continue and pick up this conversation another time. But thank you very much for what you've had to say this evening.
Thanks so much.
It's another break, hence the abrupt end to that fascinating chat. After it, Canadian journalist David Krayden talking about how a court has ruled the government's use of emergency powers to smash the truckers' freedom convoy was unjustified. I am Neil Oliver, live on GB News.
(2024), a battleground year.
The year the nation decides.
As the parties gear up their campaigns for the next general election.
Who will be left standing when the British people make one of the biggest decisions of their lives?
Who will rise?
And who will fall?
Let's find out together.
For every moment, the highs, the lows, the twists and turns.
We'll be with you for every step of this journey.
In 2024, GB News is Britain's election channel.
Your weekend starts here with Friday Night Live with me, Mark Dolan, 8 till 9 on GB News. Big stories, big guests and big laughs as we get you ready for a cracking weekend. That's Friday Night Live with Mark Dolan, Fridays 8 till 9 on GB News. Bring your own drinks, the admission's free.
Wake up to the headlines with headliners every morning at 5 a.m. We treat you to the day's biggest stories before anyone else, 7 days a week. You can catch up on everything you need to know before you've even had your kippers. Headliners every morning at 5 a.m, only on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
In the GB Newsroom, we bring you the news as it happens. With our team of dedicated journalists across the UK, we're ready to give you accurate reporting every day. When the news breaks, we'll be there with bulletins on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Big news, big debates, big opinion. Patrick Christie's Tonight is the week's biggest show. Every weekday, 9 to 11 p.m, we've got the inside track on the day's top stories. There'll be sharp takes you won't get anywhere else. We will set the news agenda, not just follow it, and I want to bring you along for the ride. Whatever it is, we'll have our finger on the pulse. It's news, but it's this close to entertainment. Patrick Christie's Tonight, 9 till 11 p.m, only on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Good afternoon, Britain.
Good afternoon, Britain. Join us, Tom and Emily,
To find out what's happening in the heart of Westminster.
and why it matters to you.
Weekdays from midday, we bring you the most compelling stories from across the United Kingdom.
And from your doorstep to our inbox.
That's right, we want to hear from you.
GB News,
Britain's news channel.
GB News, unlike other broadcasters, isn't obsessed with the London-Westminster bubble. We think there's a nation beyond the M25, and that's why we talk about the issues that matter across the land. Join me on State of the Nation, 8 to 9 o'clock, Monday to Thursday, on GB News. Daisy's listening, and you should too.
I'm Andrew Doyle. Join me at 7 o'clock every Sunday night for Free Speech Nation, the show where I tackle the week's biggest stories in politics and current affairs with the help of my two comedian panellists and a variety of special guests.
Free Speech Nation, Sunday nights from 7 on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
And from Panama to Canada, I'm joined now by journalist David Krayden to contemplate what's been happening in legal terms in a court in Ottawa in relation to the truckers' protest. Thank you so much for joining us. Can you just bring us up to date with exactly what's happened and what the consequences will be, if any, for Justin Trudeau's parliamentarians?
Well, Neil, you've been talking about absurdity today, and that's really what describes this entire incident of Justin Trudeau, Prime Minister Justin Trudeau, invoking the Emergencies Act to brutally suppress the Freedom Convoy protest in Ottawa. And by the time it was almost exactly 2 years ago, on February 14th, Justin Trudeau invoked the Emergencies Act, which had never been used before. It was a piece of legislation that replaced the old War Measures Act, which had been defunct for some years. This legislation was approved during the Brian Mulroney years as a replacement. So it had never been used, and the intent was only to use this legislation in the event of a real emergency. So Trudeau used this. And February 14th, the irony of that, of course, being Valentine's Day, he used this to suppress this protest, this completely peaceful protest. And on January 23rd, federal court judge Richard Mosley ruled that Trudeau's decision to do that was unreasonable, was unjustified, and was unconstitutional. And he should never have done it. He had no reason to do it, and he knew he had no reason to do it. And there's another story that is growing as I speak right now, that it's concomitant with this ruling, is the evidence, the overwhelming evidence now that Justin Trudeau faked his own emergency. He faked the intelligence. It was all fabricated intelligence based on a group calling itself the Canadian Anti-Hate Network, which calls itself a non-government organization, but is in fact financed by the federal government. So what they did was say that there were white supremacists and Nazis behind the Freedom Convoy. And this was all based on a single podcaster named Jeremy Mackenzie, who then asked to see the documents relating to him being some kind of white supremacist or far-right nationalist. And through the Access to Information Act in Canada, he received those documents. And it revealed that the federal government was taking all of its information from this Canadian Anti-Hate Network, of which I've been targeted myself for participating in the 1 million person march. And that's actually the last time I was on your program, Neil, was to discuss that 1 million person march. But because I was at that event, the Canadian Anti-Hate Network targeted me for being there. This is not a credible organization. It has been debunked as nothing more than a source of disinformation for Justin Trudeau. And of course, the irony of this is so pregnant, because Justin Trudeau is always calling anybody who disagrees with him as somebody who peddles disinformation, misinformation. And he's even beginning to use that term that's come to currency in the UK, malinformation.
Yes.
So anything he doesn't like to hear. And of course, like the UK, Canada is on the verge of passing legislation or introducing legislation called the Online Safety Act. And you know what that is. It's going to effectively ban disinformation, misinformation, and malinformation without even defining it.
Now,
so what has
David,
happened here?
David, can I just jump in there? Last week, I became aware of a new book by Regina Wattil about alleging hate science and suggesting that data was modelled and falsified to invert reality in Canada. You know, to make the COVID a problem of the unvaccinated, when the official suppressed data actually showed that it was people who had been jabbed who were suffering from COVID. And so there seems to be a running theme here of deliberate use of, well, falsity to prosecute a government agenda.
Yes, I actually interviewed Regina this week after seeing her on another broadcast, which I frequently go on, because I was so fascinated by this book, which I immediately obtained actually through Regina, sent me a copy. And I read the thing as quickly as I could before I interviewed her. And it is absolutely shocking, because this is the sort of study that wouldn't pass muster in high school. But this was approved by the University of Toronto and by the federal government that entirely funded it. And what is frightening about this is that we have a federal government in Canada that creates its own science, that creates its own evidence, that creates its own information to justify its authoritarian actions. So in this case, we had a study to prove that the unvaccinated were evil people. That don't hang around with those unvaccinated people. Don't let them go into the airports. Don't let them travel. Don't let them go to work.
David, just let me bring in my studio guest here as well. Jasmine, we were talking about absurdity at the top of the show. You know, what's your reaction to listening to this blatant use of misinformation, lies?
Well, you know, the terrible thing is that it's not a surprise. Certainly with Trudeau's Canada, everything that he has done, it seems to me, has been the reverse of what you should be doing. And as I'm listening, I'm thinking also about what he did with the banks, effectively debanking a whole load of truckers, ordinary people who happen to be, as you say, peacefully protesting. And this shows the potential for a CBDC, a central bank digital currency. If we had central bank digital currency, this is exactly what any government could do. They could switch off the money that you have.
Absolutely. David, one last question, just quickly, please, because I'm running out of time. Will there be consequences for Justin Trudeau off the back of this judgment in Ottawa?
I highly doubt it, with the exception, I hope, of electoral consequences, meaning his defeat in the next election. But in terms of him being sent to jail, of him being charged with any crime, absolutely not. He will walk away from this like he's walked away from every other scandal. He will continue to call his enemies racist and misogynist. And he should have been charged for freezing people's bank accounts. And it wasn't just truckers who had their bank accounts frozen. Anybody who supported that protest by donations had their bank account frozen. That is something that only happens in totalitarian regimes. And Canada is fast getting there.
David, I have to cut this short only because of pressure of time, but thank you so much. Once again, you've helped enlighten us about a fascinating and deeply troubling situation. Thank you so much for joining us.
Well, always a pleasure, Neil. Thank you.
Thank you. After the break, I'll be joined by Dutch farmer Jos Ubels, who will bring us up to date on the protests across Europe on behalf of the farmers. I'm Neil Oliver on GB News.
Good afternoon, Britain.
Good afternoon, Britain. Join us, Tom and Emily,
To find out what's happening in the heart of Westminster.
and why it matters to you.
Weekdays from midday, we bring you the most compelling stories from across the United Kingdom.
And from your doorstep to our inbox.
That's right, we want to hear from you.
GB News,
Britain's news channel.
Every Sunday from 11, join Michael Portillo.
There will be topical discussion, looking at the week before and the week to come. So kick back and relax at 11 a.m. on Sundays on GB News with me, Michael Portillo. GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Your weekend starts here with Friday Night Live with me, Mark Dolan, 8 till 9 on GB News. Big stories, big guests and big laughs as we get you ready for a cracking weekend. That's Friday Night Live with Mark Dolan, Fridays 8 till 9 on GB News. Bring your own drinks, the admission's free.
Big news, big debates, big opinion. Patrick Christie's Tonight is the week's biggest show. Every weekday, 9 to 11 p.m, we've got the inside track on the day's top stories. There'll be sharp takes you won't get anywhere else. We will set the news agenda, not just follow it, and I want to bring you along for the ride. Whatever it is, we'll have our finger on the pulse. It's news, but it's this close to entertainment. Patrick Christie's Tonight, 9 to 11 p.m, only on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Join us every night on GB News at 11 p.m. for Headliners, which is 3 top comedians going through the next day's news stories, which is exactly what you need, because when the establishment has gone crazy, you need some craziness to make sense of it.
Headliners. You don't have to bother reading the newspaper. We've got it covered for you. Every night at 11 p.m. and repeated every morning at 5 a.m. We won't send you to sleep like some of the other paper review shows out there.
So join us 11 p.m. every night on GB News.
The People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Tired of the usual focus-tested, pre-prepared Westminster runaround? Well, so am I.
So you want higher taxes?
Is your department to blame for this? Are you rethinking this policy? Every Sunday at 9:30, I'll be sitting down with those in power to get the truth about the issues affecting you.
Let's be honest, we've known about the cost pressures of this project for years, not months.
That's the Camilla Tominey Show, a politics show with personality. On GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
I think the most exciting bit for me is talking to people.
People who I think are ignored often by the major news channels. We're going to give news they want to hear. There's a voice there that needs to be heard. I think there's a chance here for a diversity of opinion to be expressed, which you don't find elsewhere. It's really exciting.
We don't hold back. We're free to say how decisions that are taken here
affects us all around the country. Only on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Welcome back. My final guest this evening is Jos Ubels, who is a farmer in the northern part of the Netherlands, also a defender of farmers and farming, and he joins me now. Jos, thank you so much for joining us.
Hi.
I've been following the farming protests. It must be some kind of encouragement to know that I checked that there's protests now in the Netherlands, in Germany, in Italy, Scotland, Ireland, Poland, France, Romania, Lithuania, Belgium and Greece. That which started in the Netherlands has set a fire, has it not?
Yeah, it really did. You can see that in 2019, the protests by the Farmers Defence Force, we organized them. They were pretty big, and they were caused by the fact that our government decided it was a very good idea to cut the production, the husbandry and animal production by 50%. So 50% of the cows were kicked out of the country. It was some ingenious plan of our new government. This led a fire into the farmers, and they said, okay, we're not taking this anymore. The bureaucratic system is getting overwhelmed by stupid ideas, and we have to fight for ourselves. So this brought a lot of farmers to the streets, and you can see that the bureaucratic problem is not only a Dutch problem, but it is spread by the European Union and their idealistic ideas about how to change the world.
I'm fascinated, Jos, by this idea, the satellite surveillance that has been deployed to keep an eye on the farmers, that you're being watched from space. Can you talk to us about that?
Yeah, it's actually, when I heard it the first time, it's quite funny. We all know that you have the Google Maps and everything included, similar like that. You can zoom in from satellites pretty detailed to the fields and the crops. But now they decided it's very nice to check your farmers on a 3 daily base with satellites, and they use artificial intelligence, and they really check if all the farmers of the European Union sold their crops on the correct time and the correct crops. Because me being a Dutch farmer, I'm not even allowed to sow the crops that I want to sow. This is restricted. I can only sow what is allowed by the European Union and by my government, and they're checking this every 3 days.
Imagine if what is that costing? Imagine if that money was being used to offset imbalances in subsidies and all of the rest of it. Far less maybe to watch borders for human trafficking or drug trafficking. What a difference it would make.
Yeah, well, I would say if you use that kind of surveillance to drug trafficking and to drug dealers, there will be no drug problem all in the world. But they are using it to surveillance the food producers. So this will eventually cause no food production.
And Jos, how does it feel, I have to ask, that you're characterised, because of your defence of farming, as far-right extremist? How does that go down with the farming population and the wider public in the Netherlands?
Well, I think that the wider public is starting to see that it's all just used by leftist politicians that don't have any arguments. They only have stories to tell, and they back their stories up by putting us in a corner where it's easy to attack. But the funny thing is, we are not far right or whatever. But there's one thing that we can say: if you try to change the way a farmer farms for over decades from your desk, because you think it's way better to produce less and to grow less because hunger is a good thing, then you probably are very extremist thinking.
Jos, thank you so much. Thank you so much for your time this evening. So important. I'll keep on catching up with you and your colleagues. Thank you. Jasmine, we talked about absurdity at the top of the show. Do you feel the absurdity is even greater?
I really do. You know, you think, what's behind this? What are we going to have other than food that is farmed? Well, there's the processed food, which apparently Bill Gates is producing, in some of his mega farms. And I was brought up with the idea that processed food is not a good thing to have. It's really not good for you. We should have natural food. So where is this all coming from?
And more importantly, where's it all going? That's all from me this evening. Thank you to all my guests. Thank you to my wonderful panellists, Jasmine Birtles. Next up, it is, I believe, the Saturday 5. And all being willing, I will see you next week.
Looks like things are heating up. Boxed boilers, sponsors of weather on GB News.
Hello there, good evening. I'm Jonathan Vaughtry here with your GB News weather forecast provided by the Met Office. It's during the northern half of the UK that saw some of the better, sunnier breaks over the course of today. And into this evening as well, you've got the greater chance of seeing some clearer spells around to start off the night. Quite murky and cloudy across the southern half, particularly western Wales, southwest England, some hill fog, outbreaks of drizzle around. The cloud will tend to thicken in the north as we head throughout the second half of the night. Some rain eventually arriving towards dawn. But for most of us, it is going to be a very mild night. Temperatures really here what we'd normally expect during daytime at this point in February. Quite a dreary, damp start for Northern Ireland, Northern England and into Scotland as we head into Sunday with outbreaks of rain.